Welcome to the Tron Church Talking Points podcast. Today we were with Josh Johnson and Paul Brennan, and I'm Katie Piggott. We're here to discuss Sunday's sermons and just to try and mull over what we were hearing and how, what we were thinking about it after listening to them. Josh, we'll start with you because you were preaching on Sunday night on 1 John. It seemed like a very sort of tricky passage. I wondered whether, how did you find preparing for Sunday?
It was quite a tricky passage. A couple of times during the week I was audibly saying and thinking, why on earth did I pick 1 John to preach? There's quite a lot of knots that need to be untangled in this passage, and it can be open to a lot of confusion. The language of committing no sin, doing no sin, can sound to some Christians they're not Christians, and it can cause people to despair because they think, oh my goodness, well, is John really saying that I shouldn't be sinning if I'm a Christian? I hope I help people see that that's not really what he's saying. And that there isn't a need to despair. This is, I guess, the tone of the whole letter helps, doesn't it? It's not an examination. It's a pass certificate. It's saying that this is what's true of you. This is what's wonderfully reassuring for you. Not one of the sort of things that's often talked about with 1 John is it's a series of tests. And I don't think that quite matches what John's tone is. He's wanting to reassure. There's folks who've gone out from the church, and that can be a really unsettling thing, can't it? If you know people, you've shared bonds with people, and suddenly they go in a completely different direction. They go out and say, "We've got something better. You're missing out here. You've got less than us. You're not Christians to the full. Come with us, and you can have the real thing." And they leave you. Well, what human being would that not shake? And so in that setting, John is wanting to very much reassure those who've continued with the apostles with their gospel, and that helps when you're despairing with how complex a passage is. When you've got a bit of a sense of what's going on in the whole thing, you can at least be sort of anchored and mirrored with that. So I find it a real challenge, and it's not the most straightforward passage in the world.
Yeah, but like you say, there's lots of encouragements, and I like what you said about it's there to soothe, not scrutinise. Because I guess, depending on who you are, your personality type, some people can be very, very acutely anxious about their sin, and other people maybe not anxious enough. But I found what is written in chapter 3, verse 1 and 2 about how you're God's children, you're called children of God, just such a great comfort for anyone who's struggling with sin or failure in any way. But I think what you said was really helpful, like the struggle is a sign of life, isn't it? A sign that you really do belong.
Yeah, John can't be saying, okay, now you're a Christian, you're going to do no sin, because in chapter 1 he's already said, if you say that, the truth's not in you. And so one of the key objectives he's kind of aiming at in this passage is to make clear what's theologically true of believers and what's theologically true of those who aren't. To clarify, actually, those who really do, when push comes to shove, will not give up on the gospel, when they won't be budged from saying, no, Jesus is everything to me. Well, he's saying what's true of you then is that you belong absolutely to the Father. His seed is in you. You have been given rebirth and promised an imperishable inheritance. The language we've been seeing in growth groups in 1 Peter. That's what's true. And what's also, I find this, one of the most encouraging things in looking at this is that is what's true, but John recognises it won't look like it straight away. It won't look like it right now. It hasn't yet. What you will be has not yet appeared, and so we live with that tension, don't we? A wonderful, wonderful promise, a wonderful reality that we are adopted into God's family, that we can call the all-powerful Creator of the universe We can, on our knees, say, Father, and cry out to him in prayer, and all kinds of other things. We can do that, but the full reality of all that means isn't yet here and visible to us. So when we know, I made that point when things feel like maybe we are getting it wrong. Maybe there is an easier route. Maybe there's something in what these people are saying. John's want to say, no. That's not how it is for now. You're not getting it all wrong, because you know the struggles of life in this world and life following in the footsteps of the Lord Jesus. I find that tremendously encouraging, because that's a daily experience, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess it all comes back to, we live by faith, don't we, and not by sight. And often we look or feel we look very unimpressive, and are we really on the right side here? But I think John is just so encouraging. No, this is what you are, and normal, mundane Christian living is the real deal, and doesn't need to be looking impressive. So I think that was, certainly for me, that was just a very encouraging thing. The big things about you can't be ascertained visually. Our eternity is an unseen reality at the moment.
Yes. And he doesn't just clarify that for us as an encouragement for Christians, but he also clarifies where he ends up. He makes it clear what's theologically true of those who aren't Christians as well. So it can look like those who actually have abandoned Jesus, who've given up on the apostles' gospel. It can look like they flourish, but what John's saying is, well, the theological reality is what we are has yet to appear, and that's true on both sides of it. Whether the seed of God is in us, or whether it's the seed of Satan. So there's help in that too. All that is good and right will be made right in the end, and that's not yet. So don't lose hope.
I was wondering how, like in the workplace or with our families or friends, we might have people that we know who profess faith, say that they are Christians and follow Jesus, but actually have abandoned the Bible, have abandoned the obedience of faith. How do we go about sort of lovingly and graciously, engaging with those people that we know who might be like that, do you think?
Yeah, good question. I think the first thing is actually trying to disentangle ourselves and our minds. What are the particular issues? Because there are things that Christians can rightly disagree on. Whether it be baptism or all kinds of secondary issues that aren't of the essence of the faith. And so, if it's a disagreement on that, that'll alter how we deal with it, because they're still Christian brothers whom we love and can encourage and get on board with lots of things. But I think what John's dealing with isn't that. What he's dealing with is those who want to claim the name Christian, but have actually abandoned the essence of the faith. And so we see that with lots of. I talked about liberal theology. Lots of the false teaching that's around. It's very important for them to, in their spread, that they want to maintain the platform that comes from saying, well, we're Christian, we believe in Jesus, and so people will listen to them because of that claim. But the Christian faith is actually based on history. So doctrine isn't subjective. Doctrine is the interpretation of historical events. And so if people are paying no attention whatsoever to what's actually happened in history, what's been said in history, and the meaning of it that we're given in the scriptures, well, they can't really claim the name Christian. They might want to, but that's where we need to be clear in our minds, because how we engage them then is slightly different, because it's not we're happy to disagree. we can't affirm someone who is denying something about the very essence of who Jesus is and what he's come to do. We can't affirm someone who's saying that something that Jesus himself says is sin. If they're saying that's not sin, it's okay to do that. We can't affirm that. So,
and that's difficult in our culture, isn't it? Because almost like the worst possible thing you could do is like disagree with anyone on anything at the moment. So I guess, sticking our necks out and grasping the nettle is going to be really important, but difficult, isn't it?
Well, that's always been the case, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Jesus had to deal with that. The
Yeah.
early church had to deal with that. But Jesus is clear, if you love me, you will obey me. And that is how we know if we are truly one of his children, if we obey his voice. And we've got to ask questions if a purportedly Christian group is, going in a certain direction in terms of lifestyle, which historically the church has taught the opposite. You've got to ask questions. So there's no new revelation here. This is a progression out with historical Christianity. And so I think we can quite clearly see that as a departure from orthodox faith, and how we live is bound up with that. It's not just a set of doctrinal beliefs that impacts how we live. We saw that in the morning, as we'll talk about soon with Titus, but life, how we live, is intricately bound up with what we profess to believe. So I think how people are living portrays their real beliefs.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing to say about your original question is, ensuring that we ourselves are living lives that are in line with the scriptures. That in itself will hopefully communicate something to them about their own behavior, and they're going to see something at odds here. You live in that way, but I'm doing something else, and just our life will in some ways be a challenge to them, because I think, hopefully deep down their conscience will trouble them. If we are living a life which is not perfect, but seeking to follow the laws, that will stand out very clearly.
Definitely. Josh, I was wondering, what about people who were listening to you last night on Sunday and were thinking, actually, I don't love my brothers very well? Because you mentioned Cain and Abel, and you talked about fruit and how we treat our brothers. If we're children of God, are we loving the brothers and sisters in the church? What about the people that were sitting there thinking, oh, well, I'll love most of them, but not those few people over there. How, what should we do if we were thinking that when listening to you last night?
Yeah, that again, great question, and that's a big thing for John. John's known as the apostle of love. Talks about it more than anyone really, and it's kind of often in vogue to talk about we need to love one another, but what does it actually mean? How do we define that? And John's probably clearest definition of it is actually in 2 John, and I'll just read a verse. 2 John 6. He says, "And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it." So he's saying love, the commandment, is walking according to the commandments. And so his definition of love is actually keeping the law. So it interestingly linked to what we talked about in what I was talking about last night. Sin is lawlessness. So actually it's defined concretely. It's going against the law of God, which is actually going against the very character of God, because that's an expression of who he is. And so if you're wondering, am I loving my brothers and sisters well, or how can I grow in doing that? Well, the way to grow in doing that is by growing in all that the Bible teaches about the Christian life. And there's nothing more loving we can do than embracing all of that, because the law's summed up, isn't it, by Jesus himself as loving the Lord our God and one another. And so unpacking all the implications of the Ten Commandments, what does it look like to not murder? Well, it's a lot more than not just sticking a knife in someone. It's not hating. It's growing in all these things, because that pictures for us what God's kingdom is like. It's actually a kingdom where relational difficulties aren't getting worse and worse because sin runs amok. I love Edward talked about that in his sermon on Titus, didn't he? The picture if this is the church, picture if this is what a church is like, and more like this, functioning with older saints modelling wonderfully for younger saints the Christian life. And so it's easy to think of instances where we really find someone in a church just to be so frustrating and think, oh, maybe I'm not very loving. Well, we will need to show patience and grace to people, but it's a lot bigger than that. It's actually being faithful in the Christian life in all kinds of ways, taking seriously marriage, taking seriously whatever, it's limitless, the definition of that within the bounds of God's law. So I guess the answer is, if we're taking seriously growing in holiness, that's actually loving one another, because we'll be treating one another well, with grace, with patience, seeking to build them up, seeking to encourage them.
And I guess God's kind, isn't he, in exposing our sinfulness to us little bit by little bit. So we know, generally speaking, don't we, where we need to really work on loving people better than we do, or being more patient or kinder. And it's always really uncomfortable, but if we actually work on what we're kind of coming to mind, then that's important. So moving on to think about Edward's sermon, I found it very helpful, and as an older woman, I'm quite stunned to think of myself. I actually think of myself as 17 years younger than I do. But
definitely in the young
but I thought it was so helpful because it was very inclusive. It was very of the moment. The fact that no one's redundant in Titus 2, are they? So everyone has a role to play. Paul, what sort of stuck out to you from Sunday morning?
Yeah, a lot. I think a few things. So one of the first things Edward said was that holiness is always relational. We can sort of tend to think about holiness in a slightly individualistic, abstract sort of way, but actually holiness is seen in how we relate to each other, and that's constant. We're always relating, and so that's where it's going to bear out. How do we actually treat people? How do I actually treat my wife, my children, my friends, those who are more senior to me in the church, those who are younger? How do I actually treat them? And so that gives you a pretty realistic assessment of holiness. So I think that was a good point. And I guess the main point was what Titus is needing to do on Crete was to insist on self-control. That governs all the other aspects of life and how we relate across all the ages. As you said, everyone's in view here: older men, younger men, older women, younger women, slaves, Titus himself. But that fundamental thing of being able to control self, because our own desires are curved in upon themselves. We don't need to be trained in selfishness.
No. It's a massive task as well, isn't it? If you think about basically every sin, all our desires come from the self. When Edward said that, I was just thinking, oh wow, that's like a huge thing to try and tackle, isn't it? And I think he talked about killing off and dying to ourself, which is probably the opposite of a lot of what you hear in general society, you do you, and all sorts of other funny things like that. But actually, we really don't want to do us at all, because we are the opposite of what God wants us to do normally if we're just left to ourselves. So, Josh, was there anything particularly that stuck out from Sunday for you? As a young man.
Clinging on. I as you're saying about it being very inclusive, it's so profoundly helpful. Everyone's either above 40 or below 40, so there's no escaping what he was saying. But I was just very struck that there's always the possibility for us to be looking up and being prepared to actually receive instruction from those older than us, to learn from them, as well as keeping an eye to those who are coming after us, and modelling and exemplifying that we've a vested interest in one another. And I guess in that, I was just thinking it's quite helpful. It's not the only people in a church family. Sorry, it's not the minister or the staff who are the only people in the church family who are to grasp nettles. We're actually, for one another. If an older man or woman sees someone, coming after them who needs a little bit of input and help, then there is an onus on them to do that. And they don't, in a sense, they don't need permission from.
When you say grasping nettles, what do you mean? I know what you mean, but
okay.
When you talk about an older saint dealing with a younger saint and grasping a nettle, what do you mean? What examples have you got?
Yeah, I guess I mean by that, just when a word of rebuke or correction is required, where you spot a classic example with some younger folk with relationships. You see, there's a young guy's bringing along a girl to church, and there's just not really any evidence that they're a Christian. Well, that's a nettle to be grasped. There's a conversation required there. Brother, you're not really acting wisely here, are you? And there doesn't need to be, it's not permission from the elders for someone to have that conversation. Permission from the Apostle Paul, was younger and older.
Yeah, I think your point about not just being able to teach and train youngers, but as younger men, we're to be able to receive instruction and help and wisdom. So I think the young think they know everything. I remember leaving university thinking, I've got the world sussed out, I know what's going on. Little did I know, but so there can be a slight posture of I don't need to learn anything, or but I think cultivating that posture as a younger folk in the church, older saints have a lot to give, and I should be eager to receive that, and there's lots for me to learn. And I think that's, the older I get, the more I realise I don't know, and the more I need wisdom from older folks. I think it goes both ways. There's got to be a receptive attitude, I think, from those who are younger.
Yeah, I like what Edward was talking about, just like self-discipline and like trying to manage yourself, because we all have lost our tempers at various times of our life, and it's not pleasant, is it? And that's because we've lost control of ourselves. And
I don't know what you're talking about, Katie. Can't relate
Go
to
on,
that.
Kitty, tell us more about this.
What is this thing you call temper?
But I think even before I went to brush my teeth last night, I was thinking, actually, Edward's right. I was on the side anyway, but actually, just there's so many implications and consequences of having control of yourself or not. And like he mentioned at the end, this is like, it's got eternal consequences of whether we're self-disciplined or not. And I think it just shows you the importance of applying this as a whole church. Thinking just really about some of the things he said about young men. He mentioned the last point was talking about commitment and sort of like not being afraid to long-term commitment and purpose in a world where there's just a growing sense of personal fragility and fear of commitment. So what would be like words of wisdom as very almost older men to younger men in the church, do you think?
Thanks, Katie.
Must be speaking to you there, Paul.
I'm on the precipice of tipping over to the older category. I think it's a really helpful point. I've got my notes here. Don't sit on the sidelines out of fragility. Men particularly are designed to take responsibility, to assume work, to assume burdens. And I think there's always a temptation to opt out of those things. There's always easier paths to take. There can be a delaying of taking on responsibility. So I think to younger men in the church, I think the message is, are you shouldering responsibility? Are you taking on a responsibility? And I think, there's things to be encouraged about, I think, in church life. Recently we were asking, there's a great need for cleaning in the church. And I remember at Release the Word, it was, the announcement was put out, we need cleaning teams. from the students to help, and it'd be great if some of the blokes here could take a lead. Left it at that. But a couple of the young students have taken that on. They're leading teams, they're getting folk in. I think that's exactly what we want to see. Young guys taking responsibility, getting things done, and that's going to serve you well in the long term. So I think in the circles you're in, with things that are in front of you, how can you take responsibility? How can you assume burdens? Because, you know, as life goes on, they come at you. Marriage, children, work, church. I think it's an important thing not to shirk that, but to take it on.
I guess because you're saying the why is because people want to be mature. Like, it's the route to maturity to take, on these responsibilities, and I've
found that watching some of the older men in this congregation, just very, very helpful. Some who right up until well into their 80s, who have modelled just taking responsibility, not just rocking up at church on a Sunday, but when they've been involved in ministries, they don't fleck in the responsibility. They don't, it's inconvenient this week, so I'm just going to try and find someone to swap with me. No, they organise life around the responsibilities they're taking, and that was very striking to me, and it's been very helpful. But also going above and beyond, and I just thinking of a car journey with Norrie Miller a long time ago, and he just slipped in very in an unassuming way the regular pattern of his week, and how he still to a grand old age was setting aside time to invest in following up people from church and taking an interest in people, calling them, visiting them, and that was a very striking thing. And also seeing some of the older guys in church as well, working very responsible jobs, going well in their working life, but they'd be at the prayer meeting on Wednesdays. They'd be leading a Release the Word or a growth group on during the midweek as well. One of them at one stage also, as well as all that, overseeing all the pastoral care for a whole part of the city, and taking real responsibility. And you can sort of think, I'm really busy, and then you look around and see these men who have far more responsibility and joyfully chipping away at it, and it's inspiring.
And it's just actually so encouraging, because I think Edward mentioned that at the end, near the end of his sermon, just how important it is. We've got the role model of Christ, but we're also human, and it's really good to have people around us who are role models to us. So I see it definitely is not just an obedience to the Lord, but it's also because you love your brother and sister in the church, and you want them to be encouraged and not discouraged when they see your life. And so I was just wondering whether you had any other tips or suggestions for the younger and older people in our church family, how we can actually put this into practice more than we are already. I'm normally at Central in the morning, and there's actually like so many students. It's wonderful, and we enjoy talking to one another, and lots of them do interact with other folk. But for those of maybe the younger people who haven't actually spoken to an older person in the church, how could we sort of challenge them to think?
I think, I could make a little challenge. If you're a student or a young worker, make it your job to speak to an older saint once a Sunday. So, of course, chat to other students, but go and find somebody older and have a chat with them. I remember there's one of our church members who grew up in the church, and his parents always said, you can't go and get a biscuit after church until you've spoken to an adult. So just training them to speak to other folk in the church. So that's maybe one thing. The other thing I thought about was my brother-in-law in the States. He's in ministry over there, but I think at the start of the new year, they always kind of make New Year's resolutions. And he decided to call 3 men in the church every week. Just pick up the phone, no agenda. Pick up the phone, just have a chat, and just see how things are going.
Oh, wow.
And it's amazing. I don't do that very much, but when I do that, you just always get into a good conversation, and those sorts of things. Just picking up the phone or sending someone a message. Just finding ways to encourage folk, and particularly men. Because men can be quite isolated if they're busy at work and they get home and they've got stuff to do, and just there isn't a lot of time for friendship. But I think that's an important thing.
It says a lot. I remember an elder a number of years ago when I'd started just coming to the church, and I was working shifts and I hadn't been at church one Sunday. And I think maybe the Monday or Tuesday I got a call from one of the elders, and I was like, oh no, what have I done? But they were just calling asking, oh, why weren't you at church on Sunday? Are you okay? And I was so touched by the fact that they'd bothered to phone me, because they didn't need to do that. I hadn't been around long, but it just made such an impact. And I just, it just shows you like just something simple as a phone call can make a massive impact. One just last thing really from Edward's sermon, he mentioned quite a bit about the witness of the church and just how important self-control, self-discipline, for us to be growing maturity is just such an important witness to society, isn't it? So, any thoughts on that?
Got a few, Josh.
I think it's a beautiful thing when the church functions as it's meant to function, and it's encouraging for those within, but also when people can look and see a church that's ordered with healthy, fruitful relationships with one another, that does speak. It is a great witness, but it's also one of the things that about that is in the climate we live in. Paul distinguishes between men and women, and so actually seeing in the church older women actually modelling what it is to be women to women in a world that's so confused, and older men modelling what it is to be men to men. That will speak in the midst of all the confusion and insanity. Seeing somewhere that's an oasis of seeing normality and order, well, that's going to be very, very appealing.
Yeah, I think there can be a temptation to think, what we're advocating here is sort of old-fashioned, not relevant, but the Lord knows better than we do what is attractive to people. And the Lord knows better than we do what's going to adorn the gospel. And what Paul's setting out here will adorn the gospel. It'll be massively attractive to people because there is so much nonsense and confusion. But when they, as Josh said, when they see a well-ordered, functioning church with functioning families, that is attractive. That's going to be the fragrance of life for so many people. For others, it'll be the fragrance of death. But for many, it's going to be a wonderful, attractive thing. And, as James Phillips said, what will convince men is not bare doctrine, but the fact that it works. When people see the gospel lived out, that is so compelling. So I think Titus is a great evangelistic letter. There's a core witness aspect to it. So encouraging.
We could probably be chatting about it all day, but we're not going to. Josh, are you on next week?
Yes, we're continuing on with 1 John, and subject to change. We'll be looking at verses 13 to 24 of chapter 3.
Great. And is Edward preaching on Titus again?
He is.
Wonderful. Well,
I believe he'll be on the 11 to 15, the two appearances.
Okay, great. Thanks, Will. Thanks for listening and joining us, and hopefully you'll be back next week. Thanks.